She heard his name before she saw him. That was how it always was with Nathaniel Ashcroft. He entered rooms the way weather entered rooms. You felt the change before you understood what had changed. A shift in the air, conversations adjusting, heads turning. Eliza was mid-turn in a waltz with Lord Pemberton when she heard it. Ashcroft, Duke of Merrow. She missed a step, just one. Pemberton didn't notice. He was talking about his horses and hadn't stopped for some time. She recovered. She kept her chin level and her smile in place, and she told herself not to look. She looked. He was across the ballroom, tall, dark coat, the particular stillness of a man who had walked into a room and already assessed every person in it. He wasn't scanning the crowd. He was looking directly at her. She felt it like a hand around her throat. 3 years. 3 years, and he looked exactly the same, which was deeply unfair, and he was looking at her like that, which was worse. Not the way he used to look at her. That was gone, completely gone, replaced by something that had been sharpened and kept sharp. Don't react, she told herself. You're in the middle of a ballroom. Don't react. The waltz ended. She thanked Pemberton. She turned toward the side of the room where the champagne was, because champagne felt necessary, and she had taken exactly 4 steps when... Mrs. Harlow. His voice. Right there. She stopped. She turned around slowly, the way you turned toward something you'd already decided not to be afraid of. He was closer than she'd expected. A foot away, maybe less. And up close he was. The same. Still the same. Except for the eyes. The eyes had something in them she'd never seen before. Controlled and cold, and underneath both of those things, something older. Your Grace, she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. His gaze dropped. Not to her face. Lower. To her throat. To the collarbone where the necklace sat. The one George had given her on their first anniversary. Delicate gold, with a single dark stone. Then to her wrist. The bracelet. Also gold. A gift she hadn't particularly wanted, but had worn tonight because it matched. He looked at these things for a long moment. Then he looked back at her face. I know these, he said. She blinked. I beg your pardon. The necklace, he said. The bracelet. His voice was perfectly level, conversational almost. I bought them yesterday evening. The ballroom kept going around her. Music, laughter, the clink of glasses. 40 conversations she was no longer part of. She stood very still and looked at him and tried to understand what he had just said. Yesterday evening. George had been out yesterday evening. He'd said, what had he said? Cards with Fenwick. Back late. Don't wait up. I bought them yesterday evening. She felt the understanding arrive the way cold arrived. Slowly at first, then all at once, reaching the bones before you'd realized it had gotten in. George had sold her jewelry. George had sold her jewelry to Nathaniel Ashcroft. That's... she started. Mrs. Harlow. She stopped. He had extended his hand. Gloved, formal, entirely correct. The gesture of a gentleman asking a lady to dance. Nothing improper about it. Nothing anyone watching could object to. Everyone was watching. She could feel it. The quality of attention that a ballroom developed when something interesting was happening near the champagne. Heads not quite turned. Conversations not quite paused. The particular alertness of 50 people pretending not to look. If she refused him, they would all see her refuse him. They would wonder why. They would talk about why. By tomorrow morning, the wondering would have become a story, and the story would have details that hadn't been there at the beginning, and George would hear it, and... She put her hand in his. He danced well. She'd forgotten that. Or she'd tried to forget it, along with a great many other things about him that were inconvenient to remember. The way he moved, the way he held her, correctly, at the proper distance. Nothing that could be remarked upon, and yet, Stop, she told herself. He just told you he bought your jewelry from your husband. Focus. The orchestra was playing something slow, and the floor was full, and they moved through it like two people who had decided, wordlessly, to appear normal. She kept her eyes on the middle distance. She could feel him looking at her. You didn't know, he said. Not a question. She glanced at him. About the jewelry, he said. You didn't know he'd sold it. That's not. Your face when I told you, he said. You didn't know. She looked away. What I knew, or didn't know, is not. No, he said. You're right. It isn't. A pause. They turned. The chandelier moved overhead. It changes nothing. She said nothing. I came tonight, he said, because I wanted to see your face when you understood. His voice was still perfectly level, still perfectly controlled. I wanted you to know that I know, that whatever arrangement you and your husband have made, whatever use you've put the Harlow name to, I know. There is no arrangement, she said quietly. Isn't there? No. Then why, he said, and his voice dropped, just slightly, just enough that only she could hear it. Are you wearing my jewelry? She felt her hands tighten in his, involuntary. She couldn't help it. They were mine, she said, before they were yours. They were Harlow's, he said. He sold them. They're mine now. He paused, one beat, precisely placed. Everything on you tonight, Mrs. Harlow. I own it. The music kept playing. She looked at him then. Fully. Directly. The way she hadn't allowed herself since she'd turned and found him a foot away. She looked at the face she'd spent 3 years trying to think about less, and she saw what was in it. And she understood. This wasn't temper. This wasn't the hot anger of a man caught off guard. This was cold. This was planned. He had walked into this ballroom tonight knowing exactly what he was going to say, and he had said it, and he was watching her absorb it with the patience of someone who had been waiting a long time and had decided, finally, that tonight was the night. Her hands were trembling. She didn't let it reach her feet. Her steps stayed exactly where they needed to be, measured, unhurried, correct. Then I suggest, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, that you enjoy the view, Your Grace, since you've gone to such lengths for it. Something moved across his face. Quick. Gone. The music resolved. The dance ended. They separated with perfect propriety. A bow, a curtsy, the correct half-smile of two people concluding a perfectly unremarkable waltz. He stepped back. She turned away. She walked to the far end of the room, past the champagne she no longer wanted, past 3 people who said her name and received a smile she couldn't feel. And she found a door that opened onto a small corridor, and she went through it, and she stood in the cool quiet of it, and she put both hands flat against the wall. She breathed. She thought about George, about yesterday evening, about cards with Fenwick, back late, don't wait up, and what had apparently actually happened instead. She thought about Nathaniel Ashcroft's face, about 3 years of silence and 1 waltz, and I own it. She thought about you didn't know, the way he'd said it, like information being filed away, like a piece of something larger being placed beside other pieces. She stood in the corridor, and she breathed, and she thought, he came here tonight to humiliate me. And then, underneath that, quieter, and George made it possible. She pushed off the wall. She went back into the ballroom. She was still wearing the necklace. 3 years ago, Eliza Vane had been happy. Not the careful, managed happiness of a woman who had learned to work with what she had. Real happiness, the kind that arrived without permission and stayed without effort. The kind she hadn't known she was capable of until Nathaniel Ashcroft had walked into her father's parlor on a Wednesday afternoon and argued with her about Beethoven for 2 hours. She hadn't meant to argue. She'd meant to be polite and peripheral, the way daughters were at their father's music halls. But he'd said something wrong about the late quartets. Confidently, insufferably wrong. And she'd corrected him before she'd decided to. And he'd looked at her like nobody had looked at her before. Like she was interesting. They'd argued for 2 hours. He'd come back the following Wednesday, and the one after that. By the 4th Wednesday, she'd stopped pretending she wasn't waiting for him. It had lasted 8 months. 8 months of Wednesdays and then more than Wednesdays. Walks, letters, an evening at the opera, where they'd talked through the entire second act, and she'd felt no guilt about it whatsoever. He wasn't easy company. He was serious and occasionally difficult, and he had opinions about everything. So did she. It turned out this was exactly what she'd needed. He'd asked her father's permission in the spring. Her father had said yes. She'd said yes. She'd laughed afterward, surprised at herself, at how simple it had been, at the improbable fact of being precisely where she wanted to be. Then she'd gone home and found the letter. It had been sitting on her writing desk, not addressed to her, addressed to her father, opened and refolded and left there, which meant he'd read it and had not found a way to tell her. And the not finding a way had been going on long enough that the letter had made its way to her desk like a confession that couldn't stay hidden any longer. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she sat very still for a long time. Her father's business, the respectable, careful, quietly managed import concern he'd run for 30 years, had a history that predated Eliza's understanding of what history meant. Decisions made in the 1820s, when she'd been a child, a partner, an arrangement that had been, at the time, expedient, and then, gradually, something worse than expedient. The letter was from a man who knew, who had known for some time, who was content to stay quiet, for a price, as long as the Vane family remained. Unremarkable. Unnoticed. Not the kind of family whose name appeared in newspapers alongside a duke's. A connection to Ashcroft, the letter said, would make quiet considerably more difficult to maintain. She'd understood immediately. The moment she married Nathaniel, this man would talk. What he said would ruin her father, not socially, not merely embarrassingly, but legally, criminally. The arrangements of the 1820s had not been legal, and everyone involved had known it, and her father had spent 30 years being very careful, and it had almost worked. Almost. She'd sat at her desk until dark. She hadn't told her father she'd found the letter. She hadn't told Nathaniel. She hadn't told anyone. She'd written a note instead. I find I cannot continue our understanding. I am sorry. Please do not write. 9 words. She'd rewritten it 4 times, trying to find a version that was kinder, and had concluded that there wasn't one, that the kindest thing was the cleanest thing, a cut rather than a tear. She'd sent it on a Tuesday so he wouldn't come on Wednesday, and she'd have to see his face. She hadn't seen his face. She'd spent the following months imagining it. He'd written once. 1 letter, controlled and brief, asking if she was certain. She hadn't replied. Replying meant explaining. Explaining meant the letter. Her father. 30 years of careful management undone in a season. She'd moved her father to a quieter part of the city. She'd married George Harlow 14 months later, because George Harlow was nobody. Pleasant and unremarkable, and connected to nothing that mattered. And being Mrs. Harlow made her Eliza Vane only on paper, which was far enough away. She'd told herself it was enough. Nathaniel had told himself she'd simply chosen differently. That was the only explanation that held together. He'd reviewed the others. Something he'd said. Something he'd failed to say. Something in the 8 months that had been wrong without his knowing it, and none of them held. He'd been thorough about it. He was thorough about most things. The conclusion he arrived at was, she had decided he wasn't worth the difficulty of it. The title, the expectations, The weight of becoming a duchess when you'd started as a music teacher's daughter in a quiet parlor on a Wednesday afternoon. He'd decided this was understandable. He'd decided it was not forgivable. He'd decided, eventually, not to think about it at all. He'd gotten quite good at this, at sealing rooms off. This one he'd sealed in the autumn of 1841, and he'd kept it sealed for 3 years, and it had been fine. Then he'd heard the name Harlow in a room full of men talking about debts. Harlow selling everything, even his wife's jewelry, I hear. If you want the pieces, they're going cheap. He'd paused his conversation. He'd asked, carefully, which wife? He'd been told. He'd thought about a sealed room and 3 years of not thinking about it, and something cold and deliberate had settled in him like a decision being made. He'd bought the jewelry that evening. He'd gone to the Pembroke ball the following night. Now Eliza stood in a corridor off the ballroom, with both hands flat on the wall and a necklace around her throat that belonged, on paper, to the man who had just told her so in front of 50 people. And Nathaniel stood on the other side of the door, having said exactly what he'd come to say. Neither of them felt the way they'd expected to. She went back in. She'd told herself she would. She'd stood in that corridor with her hands flat on the wall and her heart doing something emphatic, and she'd told herself, you are going back in there. You are going to finish this evening. You are not going to let him see that it worked. She straightened up. She went back in. He was where she'd left him, not waiting, or not obviously waiting. He was speaking to someone, a glass in his hand, doing the thing he did in rooms, which was to appear completely at ease while seeing everything. She knew this about him. She'd watched him do it for 8 months, and she knew exactly what it looked like from the outside and what it actually was. He saw her come back in. Something moved in his face. Brief. Gone. She moved to the far side of the room and accepted a glass of champagne she didn't intend to drink, and spoke to Lady Fenwick about nothing in particular for 7 minutes, and she was doing very well, she thought. She was managing this completely. And then the orchestra started again, and a hand appeared at her elbow, not grabbing. Just there. She looked at it. Then at him. One more, he said, quietly, just for her. She should have refused. She knew she should have refused. She'd had the words ready, a prior engagement, a headache, anything. But refusing meant a scene, and a scene meant tomorrow's conversation in every drawing room in London, and she was already going to be in enough of those conversations. She put her hand in his. This dance was slower. The waltz before had been fast enough to hide in. The movement, the other couples, the noise of it. This was quieter, more deliberate, the kind of music that didn't let you look anywhere except at the person in front of you. She looked at his cravat. You came back, he said. I live in London, she said. I don't have the option of being driven out of ballrooms. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. A pause. They turned. The chandeliers overhead threw everything in gold. 3 years, he said. And you walk back in like nothing. Like nothing what? She said. Like nothing happened? Something happened. You just don't know what it was. I know what happened, he said. You wrote 9 words and disappeared. Yes, she said. I did. No explanation, no conversation. 9 words. Yes. And then Harlow, he said. The name landed like something dropped on a hard floor. 14 months later, a man like Harlow, Eliza, don't, she said. A man who sells his wife's jewelry to pay his debts. Don't. And you want me to believe there's something I don't know? What is there to know? You chose him. You chose. That never... He stopped. His jaw was tight. The controlled voice had slipped, just slightly. Just enough. I'd like to understand what I did, in 8 months. What I did that made Harlow the better option. She looked at him then. He was looking back at her, and the cold, deliberate thing she'd seen in the ballroom earlier was still there. But it had company now. Something less controlled. Something that had been kept behind the coldness and had gotten out in the turning and the slow music. Something that looked, if she was honest, like the same thing she'd been carrying for 3 years, dressed in different clothes. She felt it hit her somewhere it needed to hit. Stop, she told herself. He came here tonight to humiliate you. The jewelry, the dance, all of it planned. She knew that. She also knew that the look on his face right now had not been planned. You didn't do anything, she said, quietly. That's not. She stopped, started again. There are things you don't know. That's all I'm saying. Then tell me, he said. Here? Now? Yes. In the middle of Lady Pembroke's ballroom, she said, while 50 people watch us dance. He said nothing. No, she said. Not here. They danced for a moment in silence. The music moved around them, unhurried and indifferent. You're not going to tell me, he said. Flat, like a conclusion being reached. I'm telling you, she said, that you don't have the full picture. What you do with that is up to you. Very convenient, he said. 3 years later. I know, she said. I know how it sounds. Then you know why I don't. Yes, she looked at him directly. I know exactly why you don't believe me, and I know exactly why you came here tonight. And I know what you wanted to happen, and she stopped. And, he said. She looked at him. At this man she had written 9 words to on a Tuesday morning, and had been paying for ever since. At the face she'd spent 3 years trying to think about less, and had apparently not succeeded, because here she was, in his arms, in a ballroom, and it felt exactly as it had no business feeling. And I'm tired, she said, of carrying things alone. The music slowed toward its end. You came here to hurt me, she said. Quiet. Even. You did that. The dance and the Muckerhurler, all of it. I felt it. You can know that you succeeded. She held his gaze. But you did it knowing nothing. And that, she paused, that I can't forgive as easily. The last note fell. They separated. Correctly. Properly. The bow, the small step back, the precise choreography of 2 people concluding a perfectly unremarkable dance. She looked at him one more time. You came here tonight thinking you knew exactly who I was, she said. You don't. You never did. She turned. She walked away. This time she didn't go to the corridor. She went back into the room, back to the champagne, back to Lady Fenwick, back to the ordinary noise of an ordinary evening, because she had decided in that corridor that she wasn't going to be driven out, and she meant it. Behind her, she heard nothing. No footsteps following. No voice. Just the orchestra starting up again, cheerful and oblivious, and the sound of 50 people who had been watching, and were now, slowly, looking away. She stood at the edge of the room. Her hands, inside her gloves, had stopped trembling. Across the ballroom, Nathaniel stood where she'd left him. He stood there for longer than was strictly natural. He thought about you, never did. He thought about 9 words in 3 years, and a man called Harlow, and a necklace he'd bought out of cold, deliberate spite, and placed around her throat tonight, in the middle of a room full of people. He thought about her hands trembling in his, and her steps not trembling at all. He thought about, there are things you don't know. He picked up a glass from a passing tray. He drank it. He thought, what don't I know? The carriage ride home was silent. George didn't seem to mind. He was in good spirits. She could tell by the way he sat, slightly expansive, the looseness of a man who had drunk enough champagne to feel that the evening had gone well. He looked out the window at the passing streets with the mild satisfaction of someone tallying a successful night. Eliza looked at her hands. She'd put her gloves back on before leaving. The necklace was still at her throat. She hadn't taken it off, hadn't been able to bring herself to, which she didn't examine too closely. the bracelet on her wrist. Both of them. Still there. I bought them yesterday evening. She thought about how to say it. Whether to say it tonight or wait until morning when she was less likely to say something she couldn't take back. She thought about George's face in the ballroom. She'd looked for him after the waltz, found him near the card room, his expression doing something she hadn't been able to read at the time. She could read it now. He'd seen the dance. He'd recognized Nathaniel. Everyone recognized Nathaniel. The Duke of Marrow was not a man you failed to recognize. And George had watched the Duke of Marrow dance with his wife, and had stood near the card room with that expression on his face, not jealousy. She knew what George's jealousy looked like, and it wasn't that. Something more calculating than jealousy. The carriage stopped. They went inside. The house was quiet. The staff retired. The entrance hall, lit by a single lamp, turned low. George handed his coat to the night footman and moved toward the stairs with the unhurried ease of a man heading to bed. "George," she said. He turned. "The jewelry," she said. "My necklace. The bracelet." He looked at them. His expression didn't change. Not guilt. Not apology. Just a kind of waiting. "You sold them," she said. "I had debts," he said. Simply. Like this was an explanation. "They were mine," she said. "My anniversary gift. You sold my jewelry without telling me." "I intended to replace them," he said, "when things settled." "To whom?" she said. "Who did you sell them to?" A pause. Brief. "Does it matter?" "Yes," she said. "It matters considerably." George looked at her for a moment. Then he moved to the sitting room. Not urgently. Just redirecting. The way he redirected conversations that were becoming inconvenient. She followed. He poured himself a drink. Didn't offer her one. "Ashcroft," she said. "You sold them to Ashcroft." "He made a fair offer," George said. "He came to the ball tonight to humiliate me," she said. "In front of everyone. He danced with me and told me he owned them. That he owned everything on me." "Yes," George said. "I saw." She looked at him. "You saw," she said slowly. "He danced with you for some time," George said. He swirled his glass. He was attentive. "He was not attentive," she said. "He was Eliza." Something in his voice made her stop. He was looking at her now with an expression she hadn't seen before, or hadn't noticed before, or hadn't wanted to notice. Thoughtful. Considered. The expression of a man who had been turning something over in his mind all evening and had decided to say it. "Ashcroft's interested," he said. "That's obvious. A man like that doesn't dance with a woman in front of 50 people for nothing." "He did it to embarrass me," she said. "Because he..." "Perhaps," George said. "At first." He set his glass down. "But I watched his face, Eliza, and by the end of that dance, he wasn't thinking about embarrassing you." She felt something cold move through her. "What are you saying?" she said. George picked up his glass again. He wasn't looking at her now, looking at the fireplace, at the low coals, at something she couldn't see. "I'm saying," he said carefully, "that Ashcroft is a wealthy man. A very wealthy man. And he's clearly not indifferent to you." A pause, precisely placed. "And I'm saying that if a situation were to develop between two people who were clearly not strangers to each other, George, it might be the case that certain arrangements could be made that would benefit. Stop. Everyone involved. These debts, Eliza, they're not small, and if there were a way to resolve them that required very little from..." "Stop talking." He stopped. She was looking at him. She had known, on some level, that George was not a large man. Not in the ways that mattered. Not in courage. Not in principle. Not in the basic decency of keeping what was yours and not selling what was someone else's. She had known this, and she had managed it, and she had told herself that small men were manageable, and that manageable was enough. She looked at him now, and she understood that she had been wrong about what small meant. "You're suggesting," she said. Her voice was very quiet, very clear. "That Ashcroft and I." "I'm not suggesting anything improper," George said quickly. "I'm simply observing that people of means sometimes find ways to help those in their social circle, and that if Ashcroft were inclined to be generous out of regard for you, then naturally I would expect." "You would expect," she said. "A husband has certain—" "You would expect to be paid," she said. "For me." The word landed in the room and stayed there. George's face did something complicated. "That's not what I—" "That is exactly what you said," she said. "Dress it however you like. That is what you said." "Eliza," she looked at him. Just looked at him. She had cried, once, when she'd written the note to Nathaniel. 9 words on a page, and she'd sat at her desk until dark, and she'd cried, quietly, alone, and then she'd stopped, and she'd gotten on with it. That was the last time she'd cried over a decision. She wasn't going to cry now. She was going to look at her husband, at this small, careful, endlessly calculating man she had married because he was nobody, because being Mrs. Harlow had seemed like safety, because she'd needed to disappear, and he'd offered her somewhere to disappear to, and she was going to look at him until she had fully understood what she was looking at. She looked for a long time. George, to his credit, held her gaze for about 15 seconds. Then he looked at his drink. "I think," she said finally, "that I'll go up. Eliza." "Good night, George," she said. She went upstairs. She went to her room, the one she'd made hers over 3 years, the books on the shelf and the writing desk by the window, and the small piano in the corner that she played when no one was listening. She went inside. She locked the door. She sat in the chair by the window, and she looked at the dark street below, and she was very still for a long time. She thought about the letter, 3 years ago, about 9 words on a page, about her father, about the careful life she'd built around protecting him, about George Harlow, who had seemed like safety and had turned out to be something else entirely. She thought about a ballroom and a waltz and everything on you tonight. I own it. She thought about what George had just said, the words of it, dressed up and careful and cowardly, and what they had actually meant underneath the dressing. She thought about what kind of woman she was going to be now. She sat in the chair by the window until the street outside went from dark to darker, to the first gray suggestion of morning. Then she made her decision. Not a dramatic decision. Not a loud one. Just a clear one, the kind that arrived quietly after a long night and sat solidly and didn't move. She went to her writing desk. She opened the drawer. She took out a piece of paper. George was gone when she came downstairs. This was not unusual. George kept irregular hours. He always had, even in the early days when she'd still been making efforts to understand his rhythms. He came and went with the vague purposefulness of a man who was always on his way to something without ever quite arriving. She stood in the entrance hall and listened to the empty house. Then she put on her coat and went out. Her solicitor's name was Mr. Aldrich. He was 60, methodical, and had handled her father's affairs for 20 years before she'd quietly, separately, begun consulting him on her own matters 3 years ago. Not about the marriage. The marriage had seemed manageable at the time. About her own finances, her own small income from teaching, kept in her own account, separate from George's considerable chaos. The lease on the studio where she gave lessons 2 mornings a week in her name alone. Small things, careful things. The things a woman did when she understood, without quite admitting it, that she was building a floor to stand on in case the ground gave way. The ground had given way. She sat across from Mr. Aldrich, and she told him what she needed. Not everything. She didn't tell him about the ballroom, about the dance, about Nathaniel Ashcroft's voice in her ear saying, "I own it." She told him the relevant parts. George's debts, which were considerable and documented. The jewelry, sold without her knowledge or consent. and the conversation last night, which she described in plain language, without the dressing George had put on it. Mr. Aldridge listened. He made notes. His expression did not change, which was one of the things she valued about him. "The grounds are sufficient," he said, when she'd finished. "The financial misconduct alone, the sale of your property without consent, gives us a clear position. The rest," he looked at his notes, "the rest establishes character. It will be useful." "How long?" she said. "These things take time," he said. "But you're in a stronger position than most. Your finances are separate. Your property is documented." He looked at her. "You've been careful, Mrs. Harlow." "I've been prepared," she said. "There's a difference." He almost smiled. "Yes, there is." She stood. She pulled on her gloves. "One more thing," she said. "My father. His affairs. There's a matter, historical, from before my marriage, that I need to ensure is protected as part of any settlement. Nothing current. But there are people who know things that could be. Bring me what you have," Mr. Aldridge said. "We'll assess it." She nodded. She went home. George came back that evening, and the evening after that. He didn't mention the conversation. Neither did she. They moved through the house with the particular careful distance of two people who had said something that couldn't be unsaid, and were managing the aftermath by pretending it hadn't been said. She watched him. She watched the way he checked his correspondence with increasing urgency, the way he went out, and came back later, and went out again. The way he stopped meeting her eyes at dinner, not from shame, she didn't think, but from the preoccupied quality of a man doing calculations. She knew what the calculations were. She'd seen them before, in her father's face, in those last months before she'd found the letter. The arithmetic of a man who owed more than he had, and was running out of ways to make the numbers work. She said nothing. She went to Mr. Aldridge twice more. She brought him the documents he'd asked for. She waited. On the fourth morning, George was gone. Not out early, gone. Gone. The wardrobe open, the good traveling case missing, the drawer of his writing desk pulled out and emptied. She stood in the doorway of his dressing room and looked at the evidence of a rapid, practical departure, and she felt not surprised, not even particularly hurt, just tired. And underneath the tiredness, something cleaner, something that felt, cautiously, like the first day of something rather than the last. She went downstairs and told the housekeeper that Mr. Harlow had gone to the country and that certain household changes would be forthcoming. Then she wrote to Mr. Aldridge. Then she made tea and sat at the kitchen table and drank it while it was still hot, which she hadn't managed to do in 3 years. London, of course, talked. This was inevitable, and she'd known it was inevitable, and she'd prepared for it the way she prepared for most things, practically, without excessive feeling. By the end of the first week, the story was in circulation. George Harlow had left. Debts unpaid. Wife behind. The creditors who'd been patient became less patient. His name appeared in conversations with the particular tone reserved for men who had failed in the specific way that other men found, both contemptible and satisfying. Eliza's name appeared too. Not unkindly, that was the thing she hadn't entirely anticipated. The sympathy of London, when it chose to give it, could be considerable. Poor Mrs. Harlow. That dreadful man. She must have had no idea. She had had some idea. But she accepted the sympathy gracefully, because the alternative was explaining things she wasn't prepared to explain. She gave her lessons. She saw Mr. Aldridge. She went to 2 small dinners and deflected questions with the practiced ease of someone who had been managing other people's curiosity for years. She did not go to large gatherings. She did not go where she might see him. Nathaniel heard it on a Thursday. He was at his club, not seeking information, not listening for anything in particular, just present in the way he was present in his club on Thursdays, which was to say, physically there, mentally elsewhere, tolerating the company because solitude in the evenings had gotten old. Fenwick was talking. Fenwick usually was. Harlow's done a runner, apparently. Debts all over the city. Left the wife behind, poor thing. Must be mortified. Nathaniel set his glass down. Harlow, he said. George Harlow. The very one. Wife's already seen a solicitor, I hear. Moving fast. Probably wants to be shed of the name before the creditors get noisy. She's left him, Nathaniel said. Other way round, technically. He did the leaving. But yes, I'd say it's mutual at this point. Nathaniel stopped listening. He looked at the fire. He thought about a ballroom, a waltz, a woman whose hands had trembled in his while her steps stayed perfectly, defiantly steady. He thought about what he'd said to her, all of it, the careful cruelty of it, the things he'd planned and delivered and watched land. He'd wanted her to feel it. He'd stood in that ballroom, and he'd wanted her to feel exactly what he felt when he'd watched her choose a smaller life and a smaller man over everything they'd... You've gone to such lengths for it. That was what she'd said, not flinching, not apologizing, just stating a fact and letting him stand in it. And then, at the end, before she'd walked away, you did this to take revenge, but you don't know anything about what really happened. He'd dismissed it at the time. The deflection of a woman caught out, redirecting blame, rewriting history. He'd been dismissing it for 4 days. It wasn't dismissing easily. He looked at the fire. Fenwick was still talking. He wasn't hearing it. He was thinking about 9 words. You don't know anything about what really happened. And the way she'd said them. Not defensive, not pleading. Certain. The way you were certain about something that was simply true. He picked up his glass. He set it back down without drinking. He thought, she knew I'd be there tonight. She wore the jewelry anyway. He thought, why would she wear them if she had anything to hide? He thought, what don't I know? The fire burned. Fenwick laughed at something. The club went on around him in its comfortable, oblivious way. Nathaniel Ashcroft sat very still and thought about a sealed room he'd kept locked for 3 years and the specific feeling of a key turning in a lock you'd decided would never open. He came on a Tuesday. She didn't know why Tuesday specifically. Perhaps he hadn't planned it for Tuesday. Perhaps it had simply been the day he'd run out of reasons not to come. She'd been expecting him for a week, not with certainty, not with any particular evidence. Just the feeling of something unfinished that hadn't finished yet. She was at the piano when she heard the knock. Not the studio, her own small piano, in the sitting room of the house she'd taken on a short lease in Bloomsbury, while Mr. Aldridge worked through the Harlow business. Modest, clean, enough. She'd brought 4 things from the Harlow house: her books, her music, her writing case, and the clothes she'd purchased with her own money. Everything else she'd left. She opened the door. He was in his good coat, which meant he'd thought about coming. His hat was in his hands, which meant something else. She wasn't sure what yet. They looked at each other across the threshold. Your Grace, she said. Mrs. Harlow, he said. Vane, she said. I've gone back to Vane. A pause. He absorbed this. Miss Vane, he said. She stepped back from the door. She didn't offer tea this time. She wasn't sure this was a tea conversation. She sat in the chair by the window. He sat across from her, not comfortably on the edge of it, the hat still in his hands. She waited. He looked at the room, at the piano, the books, the writing case on the desk, at the absence of anything that suggested George Harlow had ever existed. You left quickly, he said. There wasn't much worth taking, she said. The jewelry is yours, she said. You bought it. Keep it. He looked at her. I don't want. Then sell it, she said. Give it away. It doesn't matter. He was quiet for a moment. You left him, he said. Harlow. He left first, she said. I just made it permanent. Why? She looked at him. Why? He said again. After 3 years. Why now? Because he said something, she said, that made staying impossible. What did he say? She looked at the window, at the Tuesday Street, ordinary and unhurried, a cart going past, 2 women with a basket between them. He implied, she said carefully, that my acquaintance with you might be useful. To him, financially. Silence. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She could feel the quality of the silence change. Nathaniel stopped, started again. He suggested that you and I. He suggested that if a arrangement developed between us, he would expect to benefit from it. She kept her voice even. He was very careful not to say it plainly, but it was plain. The silence was different now, heavier. I see, Nathaniel said, very quietly. So I left, she said. Not because of you. Not because of the ballroom. Because of that. She looked at him now. Is that what you came to ask? He looked at her steadily. No, he said. That's not what I came to ask. Then what? He set his hat down on the side table, both hands free now. He looked at them for a moment, then at her. You said I didn't know anything, he said. Twice, in the ballroom, and at the end of the dance. He paused. I've been thinking about it for 10 days. She said nothing. You left, he said. 9 words. No explanation. And then Harlow. And 3 years. And now, he stopped. I want to understand. What I don't know. She looked at him. She thought about Mr. Aldrich, about the documents, about a letter she'd found on her writing desk a lifetime ago. She thought about how long she'd carried this, not just 3 years, longer, the whole weight of her father's careful secret and her own careful silence around it. She thought about being tired. It's a long story, she said. I have time, he said. She told it plainly. Not everything at once. It came in pieces, the way things did when you'd kept them for a long time and were finally setting them down. Her father's business. The 1820s. The partner whose name she didn't say. And the arrangements that had seemed expedient and had become something worse. The man who knew. The letter. Nathaniel listened. He didn't interrupt. She'd expected interruptions. Questions. Challenges. The skepticism of a man who had spent 3 years constructing a version of events and was now being asked to dismantle it. But he just listened, with the quality of attention she'd forgotten he had, the kind that made you feel the words were going somewhere real. The letter said, she continued, that a connection to Ashcroft would make quiet considerably more difficult to maintain. She kept her eyes on the window. If I married you, this man would talk. What he said would ruin my father. Not socially. Legally. A pause. So I wrote 9 words. And I didn't explain them because explaining them meant telling you about my father. And telling you meant you'd have tried to fix it. And fixing it meant it would have been in the open, he said quietly. Yes. And your father would have been finished. She looked at her hands. He spent 30 years being careful. I wasn't going to undo that in a season because She stopped. Because you what? He said. She was quiet for a moment. Because I wanted something for myself, she said. That's the part I've never said out loud. She looked at the window. I wanted you. I wanted the Wednesdays and the arguments and all of it, and I couldn't have it. And that was, she stopped again. That was mine to carry, not yours. The room was very quiet. She heard him breathe. She didn't look at him. She'd said enough. More than enough. More than she'd planned to say when she'd stepped back from the door, and she wasn't sure she could manage his face right now, on top of everything else. Then she heard him set something down, his hands on his knees, the small sounds of a man sitting very still. She looked. His face had changed. Not all at once. She watched it happen, slowly, the way ice changed in the first week of spring. Not dramatic, just the thing that had been set hard beginning to shift, the controlled coldness still there, but underneath it, moving through it, something she recognized because she'd felt it herself on a Tuesday morning 3 years ago when she'd sat at her desk and written 9 words. Understanding. And then, following close behind understanding, the thing that was worse than anger, worse than hurt. The specific weight of a person realizing that the story they'd been living in was the wrong story entirely. You protected him, he said. Yes. And you didn't tell me. No. Because you thought because I knew you'd try to help, she said. And helping would have made it worse. And I couldn't ask you to stay out of it, because asking meant explaining. And she stopped. It was a circle. Every way out made things worse. So you chose the way that was worst for you, he said. She looked at him. I chose the way that protected my father, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away. At the piano, at the books, at the ordinary modest room she'd built from nothing in 3 years. And she watched something move through him that had no clean name. Not guilt exactly. Not anger. Something larger than both. The thing that arrived when you understood that you'd been carrying the wrong weight in the wrong direction for a very long time. I came here tonight, he said slowly, because I thought I'd been lied to. 3 years ago. He stopped. I was wrong about that. Yes, she said. You didn't lie to me. No, you just... He stopped again. You just didn't tell me the truth. There's a difference, she said quietly. Yes, he said. There is. He looked at his hands. Though I'm not sure it changes what I did in that ballroom. No, she said. It doesn't. He looked up. She held his gaze. I came here with the wrong question, he said. You came here with the right one, she said. You just asked it badly. Something moved across his face. The involuntary kind. The kind that happened before you could stop it. Not quite a smile. The shadow of one. Then it was gone, and he was looking at her with the full weight of everything. 3 years, a ballroom, 9 words on a page, a letter her father had left on a writing desk. And she looked back at him and let it be what it was. A long time. I'm sorry, he said. Just that. No architecture around it, no qualifications, no careful management of how it landed. Just the words, plainly. She sat with them. I know, she said. He didn't leave right away. She hadn't asked him to stay. She hadn't asked him anything. They'd sat in the sitting room with the weight of everything she'd just said, settling into the space between them. And he'd stayed. And she'd let him. And outside, the Tuesday street had gone from afternoon to early evening, without either of them particularly noticing. At some point, she'd made tea. Not because it was a tea conversation. She'd been wrong about that, it turned out. But because her hands needed something to do, and the kettle gave her a reason to leave the room for 4 minutes, and breathe without being looked at. She came back. He was still there. She set the cups down and sat, and he looked at her with the expression he'd had since she'd finished telling him. The one with no architecture around it, no management. Just a man sitting in the aftermath of understanding something he couldn't ununderstand. The ballroom, he said. We don't need to... Yes, we do, he said. I planned it. I want you to know that... I'm not going to pretend it was impulsive. I bought the jewelry, and I went to that ball, and I planned every word of it. He looked at his hands. I wanted you to feel small, in front of everyone. She looked at him. I know, she said. I felt it. I know you did, he said. That's the part I can't... He stopped. 3 years of telling myself you deserved it. And then you said, you don't know anything. And I couldn't. Another stop. I couldn't make it sit right after that. Whatever I'd built, it wouldn't sit right. Because it wasn't right, she said. No, he said. It wasn't. She looked at the window. The evening coming in now, the street going blue and gray outside, a lamp being lit somewhere across the road. I'm not asking you to forgive the ballroom, he said, or the 3 years, or the way I thought about you, what I decided you were. What did you decide I was, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Someone who chose convenience over, he stopped. Over us. She looked at him. I did choose, she said. Just not the way you thought. I know that now. Yes, she said. Now. The word landed quietly, not as an accusation, just as a fact. Now, after 3 years. Now, after a ballroom and a waltz, and 9 days of something she'd said not sitting right. He heard it. She could tell he heard it. I'm sorry, he said again. Not the same sorry as before. That one had been for everything at once, the whole mass of it. This one was more specific. For the ballroom, for deciding who you were without asking, for being so certain I was right that I didn't. He stopped. I didn't leave room for the possibility that I wasn't. She sat with this. She thought about forgiving him, not as a performance, as an actual thing, the real mechanics of it. She thought about what it required, and what it cost, and what was on the other side of it. Forgiving you, she said slowly, isn't the hard part. He looked at her. The hard part, she said, is what comes after. She held his gaze. We sit here, and you apologize, and I forgive you. And then what? We've had one honest conversation after 3 years, and a great deal of damage. Does it just end here? Does it resolve? One conversation and we're... No, he said. She stopped. No, he said again. It doesn't resolve. Not here. Not tonight. He looked at her steadily. I'm not asking for that. I know what I did, and I know what it cost you, and I'm not standing here expecting one conversation to cover it. Then what are you asking? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Time, he said. That's all. Time to do it differently. To be the thing I wasn't 3 years ago and wasn't 10 days ago. He paused. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to let me try to be worth trusting. She looked at him. At this man who had walked into her father's parlor on a Wednesday and argued about Beethoven and come back the following Wednesday and the one after that, who had bought her jewelry out of cold, deliberate spite and then stood in a ballroom with you don't know anything lodged in his chest, like something he couldn't reach to remove, who was sitting in her modest Bloomsbury sitting room on a Tuesday evening with his hat on the side table and no architecture around anything he was saying. It will take time, she said. I know. More than you think. Probably, he said. I'm still here. She looked at the table. He'd set something on it when he came in. She'd noticed, and not looked at it directly. The way you didn't look directly at things you weren't ready to address. A small cloth pouch, drawstring, set near the edge closest to her. She reached out. She opened it. The necklace first. Gold. The dark stone. The one she'd worn to the ball without knowing what it meant that night. Then the bracelet. Both of them returned, sitting in her palm. She looked at them. These were mine, she said. Yes, he said. They were always yours. He stopped. I needed a reason to come. I told myself it was about the jewelry. Was it? No, he said. It was never about the jewelry. She held the necklace, felt the weight of it, familiar. The small clasp she'd done up 100 times, the length of it exactly right for her collarbone. She looked at him. You bought these to hurt me, she said. Yes. And now you're giving them back. Yes. Why? He looked at her directly. Because they're yours, he said. They were always yours? And I took something that was yours and used it as a weapon and... He stopped. I don't want to be the person who does that. She sat with this. She thought about 9 words on a page, about a letter on a writing desk, about the specific cost of protecting people who didn't know they were being protected, and carrying it alone, and managing, and being fine. She was so tired of being fine. She held the necklace out toward him. He looked at it, then at her. "Would you?" she said, and stopped, started again. "Would you like to?" She turned in her chair, away from him, toward the window, an offering of the clasp, of the back of her neck, of something she wasn't going to name directly, because naming it directly was more than she could manage tonight. He understood. He took the necklace. His hands were careful, not hurried. She felt the cool of the chain, and then the small, familiar weight of it settling at her collarbone, and his fingers at the clasp, and the quiet, concentrated moment of someone doing a small thing with attention. The clasp caught. He didn't move away immediately. She could feel him there, not touching, just present. The gravity of him that she'd spent 3 years trying to forget was a specific and unrepeatable thing. "There," he said quietly. She turned back. He was looking at her, the way he'd looked at her in her father's parlor on the 4th Wednesday, when she'd stopped pretending she wasn't waiting for him. Like she was interesting. Like she was the most interesting thing in any room she was in. Like he'd been away for a long time and had come back to find everything exactly where he'd left it. "It's a start," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." Outside, London went on in the evening, unhurried, indifferent, entirely unaware that in a modest sitting room in Bloomsbury, 2 people were beginning something that had been interrupted 3 years ago and had apparently, despite everything, refused to end. The necklace sat at her collarbone. This time she'd chosen to wear it. That was the difference. That was everything. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.